Hans, one of the great curiosities that's always kind of bothered the two of us is why was Christian Anderson such a prominent participant in Fauci's secret teleconference? If you didn't know any better, you'd think he was the expert that they were all relying on, and indeed that's the way it was portrayed. But the reality of it is, Christian Anderson actually had no experience with coronaviruses. That title belonged to somebody like Ralph Barrick, not Christian Anderson. Anderson's expertise was in hemorrhagic fever viruses, Lassa, Ebola. And that got us wondering, why was he brought into this? Why did he sort of become like the voice? He became an author of Proximal Origin. He's obviously been very loud on Twitter trying to debunk any form of a lab leak. And that got us looking into his past. And what we found, frankly, was kind of disturbing. Let's tell the larger story here, just so people know. Christian Anderson was working in West Africa and working on these hemorrhagic viruses. And what we ultimately found is that he was involved potentially in an entirely different lab leak. What's unquestioned is he was definitely out there making excuses for whatever happened, for an outbreak. And what we're talking about here is we're talking about the infamous Ebola outbreaks that happened in two sequences. The first, which we're probably going to focus on the most, 2014 to 2016. And that was the worst outbreak ever. 29,000 people died. It was horrific. And then the second outbreak, which happened in 2018. And the reason that we bring up the 2018 outbreak is because that is the first time that mRNA vaccines were ever employed. A lot of people, I think that the first time they were employed was during COVID, and that's actually not true. mRNA vaccines have actually been around for a long time, but the technology wasn't fully there to make them viable. What happened was they came up with this new process where they'd use these lipid nanoparticles, which would surround the RNA and allow it to survive. And it is that process which was employed in 2018, whereby they developed a much cheaper, much more cost-effective vaccine for the Ebola outbreak. But they faced a problem. They were working against a very tiny, tiny market that wasn't commercial, as they put it, was not commercially viable. Now, we mention that simply because these big pharma companies were left with an obvious hunger. Here they had a new product that they thought would be fantastic, but they had no market for it. Well, COVID certainly fixed all that. So that's kind of the large backdrop, and now we're going to delve into the Kenema Lab, but maybe I'll give you a chance to jump in here for a second.
Yeah, a couple of things there. The Anderson thing, you and I noticed that right off the bat. Why that guy? Why was that guy Fauci's cleanup man, the number one cleanup man? I mean, he was the lead author on the fraudulent proximal origin paper. He was the guy who was sent out there in the media with the IC, with the Congress. They paraded him around. Here's Christian Anderson. He's going to tell you it's natural. Well, you go to Christian Anderson's website at the Scripps Research Institute, and it doesn't mention anything about SARS, Corona, COVID, nothing. There's nothing there. And then you go back into the history of that website, and as you say, he was involved with these blood-borne viruses. Now, this is a huge difference. When you have a blood-borne virus like AIDS or Ebola or various other viruses, or an airborne virus, completely different kettle of fish. But even if you leave that aside, what's the deal? How can someone who has never done any work in this area suddenly be your lead author, your lead researcher, your lead scientist? Where the hell did Fauci come up with that guy? And then, of course, as you say, we sort of started thinking a bit outside the box here. Fauci, okay, maybe he trusts him. Okay, but we couldn't find any relationship between those two guys before that time. It appears they only met for the first time on February 1st, 2020 at the secret teleconference. Anderson had received some funding from Fauci, but on the whole, he was sort of pretty junior in the scheme of things. If you look at the money and so on that flowed there, you look at some of these other characters like Peter Hotez or whatever. There was a very strong relationship, millions and millions and millions. Just picked him out because of his very egregious behavior, but many others. Where you had that strong relationship. So it was not the strong relationship between Fauci and Anderson. It was not his expertise in coronaviruses, because that expertise was non-existent. Okay, so what was it? And then I can't remember if it was you or me. We're like, whoa, maybe it was his expertise in covering up lab origin. And that was the one that actually got us to
I think
the
the
answer.
first thought that entered our mind, this is, remember when you and I went and were digging through all the grants, and we
Right,
looked at the grants that were made to all the participants in the conference call, the so-called experts. And what we found out is every party who was kind of carrying the natural origin line as a so-called expert on this conference call was later rewarded with a huge amount of grants. And I think we tallied up something like 50 million, maybe 55 million in subsequent grants that Fauci granted to just like 4 people. And I remember what jumped out at the time was looking at Christian Anderson's old grants, because we were comparing the size of new versus old. And obviously they were a lot bigger, but there was another element. Every grant that Christian Anderson had ever received was related to West Africa, and it was related to hemorrhagic viruses, hemorrhagic fever.
Being bloodborne versus being airborne.
Being airborne, exactly.
Like COVID.
So whether it was that or a combination of those two things of kind of questioning Anderson's ability to serve as an expert, who, by the way, he later altered his resume quite literally to include coronaviruses, where he never had that listed before. We started looking at what he was doing in West Africa. And turns out there's a lab, it's the Kenema Lab, and it's in Sierra Leone, which just so happens to be right at the heart, dead center of both Ebola outbreaks, 2014-16 and the 2018, both of which happened in a combination of Sierra Leone and Guinea. Now, what was always considered very strange about that outbreak, and you'll see some obvious parallels to COVID here, is that the outbreak, it was Zaire Ebola, which, by the way, is the most virulent, the most dangerous of all the Ebola viruses. I think there's 6. It's far and away the most dangerous. It's also the one that if labs always want to work on, specifically because of its lethality. Well, where does that virus naturally reside? It resides in the Congo Basin. And if you look at a map of Africa, you can see the distance between these two. It's enormous. It's something like 3,000 kilometers as the crow flies, not as people travel. So that's about 1,800 miles away. So it was the first time that Zaire Ebola had ever appeared outside of the Congo Basin. First time ever. Turns out to be the most lethal outbreak ever known. As I said, I think it was something like 29,000 people died. Well, people started wondering a little bit about, geez, that's really strange. How did this happen? Could there be a lab that was working on these type of viruses? Well, the Kenema Lab was working on the Lassa virus, and we now know they were also working on the Ebola virus. Who are the parties that ran the Kenema Lab? When we found this detail, I almost fell out of my chair because, again, bear in mind, I had no idea what I was looking into at the time. The 2 parties that are head of the Kenema Lab are none other than Christian Anderson and Robert Gary. Both of those individuals ran the natural origin narrative for Fauci, and they're both authors of Proximal Origin.
And they were both lead presenters at the secret teleconference, the cover-up teleconference that Fauci organized on February 1st, 2020. You're absolutely right. The fact that those 2 guys, who are the lead presenters, if you look at the emails to do with the secret teleconference, we're going to have Gary and we're going to have Anderson. And by the way, Gary appears to have had some tiny coronavirus experience in the past. So at least, we got to give him that, whereas Anderson had nothing. But anyway, the fact that those two guys, the guy with little coronavirus experience and no coronavirus experience, suddenly are the same guys who ran the Kenema Lab in Sierra Leone. I remember it. I mean, I fell off my tree as well. It was, I think you were the one who discovered that, and you called me, and I was like, no, that's not possible. I mean, you know how we always come across the same names in Washington with Russiagate, and they always use the same. There's always the same perpetrators and they use the same lawyers, and now we have the exact same situation, but in a completely different context. By the way, in a context which should be much, much broader, because the number of scientists in the world, the number of biologists in the world, the number of virologists in the world, the number of universities in the world is just so expansive. It's even more expansive than the whole Washington cabal. And the idea that the same two guys would be on Fauci's secret teleconference and then also at the Kenema Lab, I know that's not evidence in and of itself other than a huge coincidence, but to me it was just immediately, okay, we're going to have to focus on this. Well, and we did.
And what's interesting is it turns out there was actually a lot of speculation at the time, going back to 2014. There was a lot of speculation. It was very well covered up. There's plenty of people that ran all kinds of interference for it. But there was a lot of scientific speculation that indeed the outbreak had come from the Kenema Lab. So it's not just us from this vantage point in time saying, hey, we think it may have, the Ebola virus leaked out of Kenema. There was a large number of scientists that thought that was a very likely possibility. And I want to make sure I give credit here, because when I began researching this, two guys that had done some really good work on this, and I think they continue to do work on it, but just want to make sure it's Sam Husseini and Jonathan Latham. And they had kind of been on this from very early on. I'd never seen it before. I don't think they necessarily, I'm not sure if they have the same specialty in COVID that you and I do, but regardless, they've done a lot of great work exploring this. But nor was it just them. There was plenty of other scientists that thought this thing may likely have come out of the Kenema Lab. Now, this gives us a chance to jump over to the excuse that was provided, because just like what happened with COVID, we had some people that ran interference and proposed some theories. And as we explain the theory, you can decide for yourself if it sounds realistic or not, but proposed theories as to how the outbreak happened, 3,000 kilometers away, how it came into being. And the story that was put forth is that a little boy, 2 years old, who had a habit of going and playing in this small grove of trees. And there's a picture of the tree to this day. It's like in the middle of nowhere, just this tree by itself, not in the middle of a jungle, just a tree. A little kind of a bowl carved out. And they claim that some bats lived there, and he loved to go play with the bats. And that's where he was patient zero, and he contracted the virus. So maybe you can elaborate on that a little bit, and we can discuss who actually wrote this theory as well, because that's equally relevant.
Yeah, no, by the way, everything we're talking about, we sort of reverse engineered. I mean, huge credit to the guys you just mentioned, because they discovered all these things in real time in 2014, 15, and so on. And where, I had no idea back then that any of these things were going on, wasn't on my radar.
Nor did I. I always accepted the narrative.
For us, it was reverse engineering. We went from, Anderson, Gary, oh my goodness, they were running the Kenema Lab, and then, search Kenema Lab, Ebola, and then we were like, oh, people already talked about that back in 2014.
It was just, the more I dug, the more I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was just unfold after unfold after unfold.
By the way, just as a very quick digression, some of the stuff we found in science journals from that time, 10 years ago, just kind of reminded me of the fact that it was still allowable to talk about these things at the time. In COVID in 2020, you could have never, ever written what some of these guys wrote back in 2014 about the Kenema Lab, like, oh, right, it might have come out of the lab. If you'd done that with COVID, you'd have been buried. So anyway.
Yeah, no, these questions, they were being asked. They just established a narrative to counter it, but they didn't knock these people out of circulation.
Unlike with COVID, exactly right.
Right.
So the counter narrative, I completely agree with you. When I came, and the BBC had this big story about a little boy plays in tree and causes Ebola. And I'm like, when I read that, especially BBC again, who also was very, very big on the COVID cover up, totally buying into this whole Lancet letter, Peter Daszak, and all this bullshit. So when I saw that, I immediately saw the parallels in terms of the narrative construction. So the narrative with COVID was, oh, it came out of the Wuhan seafood market. That's where it came from. And then, it's all done. We can move on now. And to be honest, that explanation, which of course was bullshit from day one and has now been dismissed even by people like Ralph Barrick, the godfather of gain of function, the guy behind the diffuse proposal to make COVID in a lab, the guy, who has his fingers all over everything. He says, no, it didn't come out of the market. The timing doesn't work. Which, other people have said from day one, of course the timing doesn't work, because then you have it kind of in mid-December, but we need it to happen back in order to think.
It was already in circulation earlier.
Back in September. Exactly. But so in a way, the market theory is both are complete bullshit, but I mean, in a way that was even more convincing. Maybe they learned their lesson from the ridiculousness of their Ebola theory, because at least the market, did have animals, and at least the market was in Wuhan, and I say that because, as you already alluded to, the little boy played in a tree in a country called Guinea, far away from all the action. And so he climbed into this tree, and there were bats there. And somehow the boy caused Ebola, and then somehow it spread all the way to Sierra Leone. And somehow there's no traces along the route, which, by the way, is another parallel here with COVID. And how did the boy get it anyway? It's bloodborne. And,
well, it's also very convenient that it was Guinea, and even Guinea's right next to Sierra Leone. They're 100 miles apart from the points of the Kenema Lab to the little boy with an adjoining border. So it's very convenient that they chose the outbreak as being in Guinea and not in Sierra Leone. And you can't tell from, the outbreak was intermingled. Nobody can say that other than they claim it was this little boy. So it's structurally very convenient that they claim that ground zero was in Guinea and not Sierra Leone.
Yeah, but I think they learned that lesson of how stupid that was, because you still have to do the transition, right? Therefore, in the case of COVID, they went to the source. They said, well, it started in Wuhan, so it must have been the Wuhan seafood market. They didn't choose the seafood market in Shanghai or whatever. So basically, the equivalent is if they had said that COVID started at the seafood market in Shanghai. That's kind of what they did here, kind of bordering, Wuhan, Shanghai, I don't know, it's a few hundred miles or whatever, but that's sort of what they did here, I guess, to divert attention from Sierra Leone.
They were trying to divert attention from the Kenema Lab, yeah. Because bear in mind, this story came out after all the questions began to be raised about the Kenema Lab. And there's a couple interesting elements to it. So I'm having to read some things here, so bear with me. But the guy that wrote the paper, his name is, I'm going to butcher this as I always do, Fabian Leendertz. I know you know this name. I think that's right, Fabian Leendertz. And who this guy is, he just so happens to be one of the authors. Well, he wrote this theory, came up with this crazy-ass theory, but he was one of the authors of the fraudulent World Health Organization's first report on COVID, claiming that COVID came from nature. And this is the same team that later admitted that they took direction not to look at a lab leak from the Chinese authorities. The whole first investigation was an utter sham. Anyway, it just so happens that the same guy who wrote this theory about this little boy getting infected out of this tree, which again, it's not in a forest, it's a tree. There's pictures of it. It's a tree standing all by itself. That he got infected there is the same guy who wrote the World Health Organization's first report. And this got picked up by all the usual suspects. I have an article in front of me here from The Independent. Ebola outbreak. 2-year-old boy from tiny Guinea village was first to be infected after playing with bats in tree stump. And there's a picture of the tree. There's another article from The Atlantic. The Beautiful Tree, the Bats, and the Boy Who Brought Ebola. And then with the subheading, researchers believe they identified where a 2-year-old child contracted the first case of the deadly disease in West Africa. To me, this feels like a test run up to COVID, and there's other parallels as well. Christian Anderson, who was part of the Kenema Lab, he was actually the vice president of a company called VHFC, which is, I think it's Viral Hemorrhagic Fever Consortium. He was the vice president. The president of VHFC was Robert Gary. VHFC ran the Kenema Lab. It's just a corporate structure name. So what happened? But Christian Anderson was brought on to give a series of presentations, one of which he did in the UK, another he did in Europe. And he basically had all these PowerPoint slides where he showed how bats, these fruit bats, would migrate from the Congo Basin up to Sierra Leone and New Guinea. And his whole presentation was schemed around this must have been the way that the Ebola virus was transmitted. Never mind that there wasn't a single intervening case of Ebola between those two massive distance points. Just like what happened in COVID. They pointed the finger in COVID to the bat caves, 1,000 miles away, 2,000 kilometers, something like that. Almost equal distance, actually a little bit less distance. And of course, in the case of COVID, we had no intervening cases once again between the bat cave and Wuhan. The exact same thing happened with the Ebola outbreak. There are no cases between, and the distances are enormous. But that was the theory that was put forth by Christian Anderson. So, and no matter what you think, whether you think that, the Kenema Lab, and look into it, I think you'll be interested in what you find. No matter what you think, what your conclusions are about how the virus, whether it was leaked or not leaked or whatever, what is not inescapable is that Christian Anderson operated in exactly the same capacity to explain how a virus made its way from one far distant point to another. He did exactly the same thing in the COVID situation. By the way, guess who else was making excuses for that? None other than Bill Gates, who made, again, the exact same case, that it was bats from a very far distance away who had migrated, carried the virus without intervening cases. He claimed the same thing for COVID. So we keep seeing these eerie parallels. And, I think you raised it where you said something to the effect of, it seems like they've refined their efforts. That's how I viewed it. Is this was perhaps their first effort, although I'm not convinced of that either. But, I do think the odds are pretty good that the Kenema Lab leaked Ebola. These guys ran their, whatever you want to call it, propaganda efforts, and they refined it, and that's why Christian Anderson was brought in. He had experience in this, and that's what made him useful in the COVID outbreak.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it doesn't have to have been a leak out of Kenema in order for the same playbook to have been used, because
that's right.
It could have been, even if it could have been, and it certainly could have been a leak out of Kenema, that means that you had the expertise, not in coronaviruses, but in cover-ups. And that's exactly what happened here. And, they also learned a bit out of like Robert Cialdini, persuasion, because what you need to persuade people is visual stuff. That's the most important stuff. And you've mentioned it already. That tree, the picture of the tree. You had it in all kinds of media across the board. Oh, the little boy in the tree, and you got the picture. And exactly the same thing happened over with COVID. We had the picture of the market. How many hundreds and thousands of times have we seen that picture of the market across some media over the past 4 years? The market,
visual
the market,
cementing.
Exactly. It's so important in these kinds of things. And I think the only there's a few refinements, but the main refinement is that the tree and the little boy. By the way, little boy is also extremely persuasive, extremely useful, because by the way, the guy was 2. The boy was 2. He was a toddler.
Was 2 years old.
How can he could go so far from home and climb a tree? It's Africa. You're supposed to believe that. Okay, whatever. But
by the way, he was 2. He wasn't 2.5. I went back and looked. And it's a tragic story because he did die. So, and his family
Yeah.
got infected. It was horrible. But he was literally 2, like just 2. Not 2.5, not 2 3/4, not almost 3. He was 2. He was like 25 months old.
Yeah, no, it is, but it's I think the way they refine so it's persuasive, of course, having a little boy and a little boy climbing a tree, and you just you have to build this narrative. I mean, the word comes from telling a story to persuade people. That's the whole idea. I mean, they've certainly learned a few tricks along the way, and with the Wuhan market, very similar playbook, only that they moved the sort of the event. I mean, they could have had the tree and a little boy somewhere closer to Kenema, but as you said, they wanted to divert from that. But maybe that wasn't so smart, because if it had been closer to Kenema, then the story might have been a little bit, more believable. And that, of course, they then did with COVID, because, as I mentioned, they made it the market that was actually in Wuhan instead of like in Shanghai or in Nanjing or wherever.
Yeah, there's a couple other quick elements I want to get here to this story. So we haven't really presented any evidence, but what I can tell you is this. When speculation of a lab leak as the cause of the Ebola outbreak came out, Gary immediately went on the defensive and was denouncing the stories as conspiracy theories. And I'm just looking down at my laptop here, so bear with me. But his quote is, "We were there," and this is at the time, 2014, "We were there working for 10 years, and then Ebola came here. We're not here to turn Lassa and Ebola into some kind of super weapon. It can do that on its own." Now, after the COVID outbreak had happened, a couple of years into it, that's when I think people, ourselves included, started looking at the Kenema Lab. In 2022, Gary wrote an article in which he claimed we did not have the Ebola virus in our laboratory, the Kenema Lab, and therefore could not have released or engineered it. But there's a big problem with Gary's claim. First of all, there's no question that the Kenema Lab was doing work on the Lassa virus, the deadly Lassa virus. No question, none whatsoever. But their own website, VHFC, also listed Ebola work. But more importantly than that, Gary's statement was actually countered, perhaps accidentally, by Christian Anderson. And it was a podcast that he did where the topic came up, and he admitted, and this is a quote, "We had been studying Ebola in Kenema in Sierra Leone, and lo and behold, Ebola emerged just a few miles from there in 2014. I'm not ad-libbing that. That is a 100% accurate quote from Christian Anderson, who's admitting they were studying Ebola at the time. Now, Anderson quickly, I think he realized what he said, because then he immediately tried to say, well, it was really a couple 100 miles away. And he started getting caught up in distance, etc., and trying to kind of change it. He also tried to pretend that any assertions that a lab leak had come out of Kenema only happened after COVID, the advent of COVID. Well, again, that's not true. There was all kinds of accusations and speculation at the time back in 2014. And there's one other item I want to get to before we circle back on mRNA, and I'll let you jump in. In 2011, before the outbreak, Reuters actually went out and looked at the Kenema Lab and did a full report on it. What they found was pretty shocking. They first of all, they said it was a mess, that there was no biosafety protections. But they referred to it as a, quote, an outpost of the U.S. government's war on terror, funded by a surge in biodefense spending since the airplane and anthrax attacks on New York and Washington. That same Reuters article noted huge safety lapses at the Kenema Lab. Again, quote, in Kenema, it is impossible to create the same levels of protection for researchers that they would experience in a Western lab. In the United States, Lassa is handled in biosafety level 4 facilities where researchers wear spacesuits. But in Kenema, measures only include goggles, gloves, and masks. And that's the lab where, at least you and I think, along with some others, that the Ebola virus emerged.
There's another aspect about Christian Andersen that few people know because the media never reports it, but which makes Christian Andersen like the least likely and the least useful COVID cover-up agent that you could come up with. Again, coming back to this issue of why Fauci chose that guy to do the cover-up. And that is a year or two before the pandemic, Christian Andersen was out there saying that Peter Daszak was a grifter. This idea of finding viruses in the wild to try and prevent pandemics was a total bullshit nonsense idea, which of course he was right about. It's completely, it's a totally idiotic. First of all, there's hundreds of thousands, millions of viruses out there. If you just go into every bat cave, every cave with every exotic animal in the world, you can find all kinds of stuff. Just leave them there, number one. Number two, if you start playing around with them and making them more dangerous in the lab, then you're the one creating the danger, not nature. So Christian Andersen recognized those things and was a big critic of the Daszak grift. And then he, of course, became his number one defender. So just for context, that always is one of those stories where, again, I'm just struck as to why Andersen was chosen, because he has to overcome that, his own history on that in terms of ignoring it or, talking it away or whatever. But
well,
yeah, I mean,
if Ebola actually leaked from the Kenema Lab and they were able to successfully cover it up, it makes a pretty good case that they were able to turn Andersen into a mercenary.
I think I absolutely certainly agree that Andersen is a mercenary. And maybe one last point here on mRNA. As you said, RNA is extremely unstable. RNA is the genetic material of viruses. DNA is of us, animals, and so on. It's much more stable because it's got the double helix, and RNA does not have that. It's very unstable. So but you need to deliver that particular RNA. You need to deliver the RNA because that's what the body needs to respond to. It needs to respond to viruses, needs to know what to respond to. So the problem is always, how do you get that into the body without it collapsing and just disintegrating, because it's so unstable. And as you said earlier, for decades, that was a big enigma. And then they came up with these lipid particles where you can put it inside, and then the lipid particle would let it survive long enough to make it into the body and make it into the cells, so that the body's immune response could start building antibodies and respond and so on. Anyway, as you quite rightly said, that it didn't start with the technology had just sort of come online a few years before COVID. But there was no viable, economic use for it, because, Ebola is bad, but not many people are affected. You're not going to sell billions of vials of it across the globe, right? And then, of course, COVID came at a very opportune time.
Yep, and that's why even though it may have been a bit disjointed, that's why we opened and mentioned the mRNA vaccine, because John Hopkins even did a paper on it, and they were sort of acknowledging the fact that there was no, and this is their words, no commercially viable market for the mRNA vaccines. The only thing they had was Africa. They had no safety tests in the United States. They acknowledged that it would likely be, potentially decades before mRNA vaccines could be used in the Western world. But they also knew there was a huge market for it. And we've always found it very curious, and maybe everybody can draw their own conclusions. But there was a symposium that happened on September 10th, and there was a paper that was commissioned. Again, John Hopkins, who keeps conveniently popping up here, and it was an 84-page study titled "Preparedness for a High-Impact Respiratory Pathogen Pandemic," September 10th, and it's a perfect description for COVID. Pretty prescient on their part. Just out of nowhere, they decided to do this. But one of the focuses for this report, it was prepared for the Global Preparedness Monitoring Board, another WHO-affiliated organization, had 15 politicians and scientists on its board. 3 of those, one of them was Anthony Fauci, another one was Jeremy Farrar, both of the secret teleconference. The other one was Gao Fu. Gao Fu's the head of the China CDC. Also affiliated with Fauci, etc., both before and after the COVID outbreak. They were the board members. That report noted that nucleic acid mRNA-based vaccines are widely seen as highly promising and potentially rapid vaccine development pathways, though they have not yet broken through with licensed products. The report recommended that mRNA vaccines should be both pursued and funded, and recommended that agencies fast-track mRNAs in emergencies, and they push for surge production of mRNA vaccines. Now, why would they be doing that in September 10th, 2019? Well, people can speculate as they want, but what I can tell you is that we've gotten pretty comfortable with moving the timetable for the actual initial outbreak of COVID probably back to June or July of 2019. We factually know, that it was circulating in the population no later than October. We know that because the head of the U.S. Consulate General in Wuhan was telling the U.S. government that it was. So anyway, you can make what you want of that, but that's why we mentioned mRNA vaccines at the outset. At a bare minimum, what's clear is there was an organic push to start taking mRNA vaccines wide. They knew they couldn't do it without safety trials, so they were looking for an emergency order under which they could do so. And that's their words, not mine.
Yeah, and I guess to close it up, I think there's just two options here. Either there was some advance inkling of some kind, the timing obviously very odd and so on, that this COVID thing would happen, which would then pose a huge opportunity to just basically unleash this stuff on the world and sell billions, and we're all guinea pigs. That's option one. Option two is that it was just a huge coincidence that it happened that way.
Possible.
But again, as soon as it happened, immediately they jumped on these plans that they had drawn up already to unleash this stuff on the world. And again, we're the guinea pigs.
And we do know, in final closing, I guess, that Stéphane Bancel, the CEO of Moderna, went to his head of production, probably it was in 2019, probably sometime in December, and told him to get ready because he was going to need to produce at least 1 billion doses of the mRNA vaccine because Bancel was anticipating a worldwide pandemic.